Well, hello. Thanks for joining us again this evening. Here I am out on my back porch or deck. It'll be a while before I get my little podcasting place or studio back, so we'll just have to do that here. Um, I forgot to turn off the air conditioners over there, so hopefully they don't interfere too much. So, in any case, let me know if you would if it's getting in the way of being able to hear me, and then I'll get up and run it off, turn it off, or something like that, which isn't very polished, but it is what it is. So, anyway, so hopefully you've been able to keep up with what we're talking about here on this podcast. Um, if you are reading Lewis and you kind of get lost in what he's saying, and it just is difficult to get your mind around that, that's perfectly normal. A lot of people do that with Lewis. He is being fairly philosophical here. And his writing style, the fact that he's from Great Britain, all of those kinds of things, language and style and things like that. Lewis can have run-on sentences, which is a little odd for a professor of literature. That was at least one of his credentials, and so he does it, I guess, to keep people in the stream of the point that he's trying to make, or he's about to make. But I will try to navigate all that for us. And so we come here then to chapter 4, entitled "What Lies Behind the Law." And so he gives a brief summary in this first paragraph, and basically he says that things happen in nature simply because of nature's laws, because that's what nature always does. So when a stone rolls down a hill, it's not because something inside the stone said, gee, gravity is an important thing here. I think that whatever thing is supporting me, now that it's been removed, I ought to roll down the hill. And so nature doesn't do that. Nature simply does what nature does. And we don't always understand why nature does what nature does. We just know that there isn't anything innate or intuitive in a tree or a stone or whatever giving it the sense that it should do this. It simply does it because of whatever natural laws are coming into play in that manner. On the other hand, he says, in the law of human nature, um, we not only do largely what nature says we ought to do, but we also do something called ought, that even when it runs counter to what nature says we ought to do, that there's this sense of oughtness, that deep inside of us there's this other law in it that really in some respects supersedes natural law, that we ought to do this thing. There's a compelling thing inside of us of this oughtness, and that oughtness is the law that's innate in us, that we know, whether we know it intuitively or innately or instinctually, we know. Now, and I may have mentioned this before, but I think it's worth mentioning again that I think that Lewis is partially informed here by a text in the book of Romans. And so I think it's helpful to read that text in Romans chapter 2. And so I think this gets to this idea of oughtness as well. And so let me just begin reading Romans chapter 2, beginning with verse 12. For all who sinned without the law will also perish without the law. And all who sinned under the law will be judged by the law. That would be everybody. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God. Just because you hear what the law says you ought to do doesn't mean that you are righteous, but the doers of the law who are justified. So there's this thing in which you need to be obedient to the law. For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature, by nature, do what the law requires. Well, what nature is that? How can Gentiles who do not have the law do what the law is required by their nature? So, what does he mean by that? They are law unto themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. And so Lewis, it seems, is tapping into this idea that Paul talks about here in Romans 2, where the law is written on our hearts and minds, and that because it's written on our hearts and minds, we can know how to obey the law. So just because you hear the law itself, as the Jews did, just because they heard it or even possess it, doesn't mean that they are justified. It means that they just have heard it or possess it. It hasn't acted upon them. But Paul goes on to say that there are Gentiles who have the law written on their hearts and minds. And they can know that law. And because they can know that law, because they sense and hear innately the oughtness about how they ought to act, that they do the things of the law. And as they do the things of the law through Christ Jesus, they are justified. So it seems to me that's what the Apostle Paul is tapping into here, and what he's arguing for. And I mean, I think that you could do an anthropological study and go through different parts of the world and bump into people whom, by their actions and how they live their lives, without them ever saying, you might conclude, well, there's just something different about these people. They act almost Christian. Like, what's going on with them? I know they've never heard about Jesus, but yet they seem to be tapped into something that guides them, and that convicts them about how to live. I think that there are lots of examples of this in the world in which we live, and so those people were able to tap into the law that is written on their hearts and minds, as Paul talks about in Romans chapter 2. So, in any case, um, he goes on to say in this second paragraph, if you're following there, he says, I now want to consider what this tells us about the universe. And so he begins to extrapolate how we understand the universe in light of these laws. He says, now I want to consider what tells us about the universe we live in. Ever since men were able to think, they've been wondering, what this universe really is, and how it came to be there. So this is true throughout. This wondering is something that people, since time immemorial, since the most primitive times in human history, there is this question: who are we? Where are we? Um, what's wrong? And how do we fix it? Those are the four kind of worldview questions. Who are we? Where are we? What is wrong? And how do we fix it? And so, these two views then kind of address that, seek to address those questions. And so he says, first, there is what is called the materialist view. People who take that view think that matter and space just happen to exist and always have existed. Nobody knows why, and that the matter behaving in certain fixed ways has just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. By one chance in 1,000 meeting, something hit our sun or whatever and made it produce the planets. And by another 1,000th chance, the chemicals necessary for life, the right temperature, occurred on one of these planets, and some of the matter on this earth came alive. And then, by a very long series of chances, the living creatures developed into things like us. So, and so Lewis writes this in a way that makes it appear kind of ridiculous that in the material universe, in the universe, material, the physical elements of the universe have always been in place. Maybe not in their current form, but the elements that make up the universe have always been here. They are eternal in that regard. And so he's basically saying these people are making faith statements by saying that the physical universe has always been here. And you would say, well, how do you know that? Well, that's our theory. Well, what's your theory based on? Is it based on the scientific method? Well, it's based on scientific research. I mean, you might ask, have you observed this happening? Did you see when the universe began? Were you there? Were you able to take measurements? Were you able to follow its development? Were you able to repeat this experiment? I mean, how are you able to know for sure that the universe has always been there? So we read in Genesis where where Moses records, um, in the beginning, the Spirit of God hovered over the void. Um, that there was a time when God created the universe that we know ex nihilo. That is, God created something out of nothing. And you say, well, how's that? I mean, where was God? Well, God is metaphysical, and out of his metaphysicality, God created the physical. So it's not like, you have the physical universe and God is like trying to squeeze in. You have God, and then out of his essence, he creates this physical universe. And so, that's what, uh, and so he creates that out of nothing. There was nothing there before, and now there is something because God did it out of a creative act, out of his power, omnipotence, omniscience, and that's what makes him omnipresent as well. So, and the size of the universe is inconsequential to God. To us, the universe seems to expand to infinity, but the scriptures are clear that it describes God as hovering over. That is to say that there that that the universe that God has created has its limitations, and that He is outside those limitations. So, I mean, that is a faith statement too. But to me, it requires less faith to believe that than it does to require the faith statements that science makes about this. Now, one other thing that I think Lewis is getting at in this portion here about how he describes the universe coming into existence, and that is that he's basically hinting at what we call the cosmological argument for the existence of God. The cosmological, cosmological argument for the existence of God. The cosmological argument is more involved in this, but it basically says something like this: that there has to be a first cause, there has to be a prime mover. So, in other words, if you were to talk to a physicist, they would say, well, every everything through all the billions and billions of light years that make up the universe, however far it goes, which seems to be unmeasurable. You have to take all of the contents of the whole universe, they will say, and squeeze it into something the size of a basketball. And so you have this material that is a basketball, and then you have this space, which has its own physical properties. And something caused this basketball to explode. And as it exploded, it expanded. And the material inside of it expanded as well. And it continued to explode. And it just continues to work itself out ad infinitum. And then over billions and billions and trillions and quadrillions of years through its expansion, um, enough things happened on their own create solar systems like ours and planets like ours, and out of this planet for life to just spontaneously emerge because the right chemical compounds come together that create bacteria, and then bacteria create other lower life forms, and those lower life forms evolve because they get the right kind of stimulus, and out of that evolutionary process higher forms of life evolve, and then over time, billions and billions of years, additional life forms and more sophisticated life forms. And why more sophisticated life forms, is a question that remains to be unanswered. But all of this happens. And so Lewis is just sort of hinting at, like, really? All this kind of happened on its own? Nothing caused it, nothing started it. It just, somebody just, somehow it just lit itself, and it did all this. And all of this is a result of that, accidentally, spontaneously, without any kind of prime mover involved. So I think Lewis writes this a little tongue in cheek, and deservedly so. I think that kind of thought takes more faith than for you and I to believe that there's a prime mover, someone who started it. So then Lewis goes on to say the other view is the religious view. According to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious and has purposes and prefers one thing to another. And on this view, it made the universe, partly for purposes we do not know, but partly, at any rate, partly, uh, partly at any rate, in order to produce creatures like ourselves. I mean, like itself, to the extent of having minds. And so Lewis is alluding here to, however we have been created, we are in some way a reflection of that mind that guided the process that ended up creating us, whatever that process was, because he's not yet gotten into the Judeo-Christian worldview of the creation itself. He says, please do not think that one of these views was held a long time ago and the other has gradually taken its place. Wherever have been thinking men, both views turn up. And that's true. There are some ancient philosophers who were kind of critical of the idea of the metaphysical world, the idea of the divine. But the preponderance of Greek philosophers and philosophers throughout the world have always believed that there was some kind of divine metaphysical entity in the world in which we live, or entities. He says you cannot find out which view is the right one by science in an ordinary sense. Science works by experiments. It watches how things behave. Every scientific statement in the long run, however complicated, looks really, however complicated it looks, really means something like, I pointed the telescope to such and such a part of the sky at 2:20 a.m. on January 15th and saw so and such or whatever. And so what he's saying is there is this scientific method that begins with a hypothesis and then works its way down to um, understand the phenomena that it's trying to study. So he is saying, do not think I'm saying anything against science. I am only saying what its job is. And the more scientific a man is, the more I believe he would agree with me that this is the job of science, and a very useful and necessary job too. But why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there is anything behind the things science observes, something of a different kind, i.e., like a God, this is not a scientific question. If there is something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known in some different way. The statement that there is any such thing and the statement there is no such thing are neither of them statements that science can make. And real scientists do not usually make them. It is usually the journalists and popular novelists who have picked up a few odds and ends of half baked science from textbooks who go in for them. I think that is still largely true, although I do think that more and more scientists make claims that scientists should not be making because their disciplines are not designed to do that. So, supposing science ever became complete so that it knew every single thing in the whole universe, Lewis says, is it not plain that the questions, why is there a universe? Why does it go on as it does? Has it any meaning? Would remain just as so. We scientists could know everything about the universe, and that still wouldn't answer the questions. Um, why is there a universe? Why does it go on as it does? Has it any meaning? Those questions would still remain, even if scientists knew everything that could be known. So, um, so then I want to go down about 4 lines in this next paragraph where he says, um, "We do not merely observe men; we are men." So, um, and so stones don't observe; men observe, and that's what makes us different. In this case, we have we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know, and because of that, we know that men find themselves under a moral law which they did not make and cannot quite forget even when they try, and which they know they ought to obey. So, in all of this thing called the universe, we exist in a different sort of way than anything else exists. And our existence seems to speak to something greater than us and to a conscience not unlike us. So, so then he goes on to say on the following page, and I want to pick it up where, let's see. Um, I'll just continue on. Anyone studying man from the outside, as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not being able to get inside knowledge from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. How could he? For his observations would only show what we did, and the moral law is about what we ought to do. So if you just study people, he's saying, you wouldn't know by the way we act or behave necessarily that we have within us the moral law. You might conclude that somebody had the moral law because you sense innately the moral law in you, but not you wouldn't know that a person had moral law necessarily just by studying them without knowing them. The position of the question is this: we want to know whether the universe simply happens to be what is for no reason, or whether there is a power behind it that makes it what it is. We want to know whether the universe is simply happens to be what it is for no reason, or whether there is a power behind it that makes it what it is. So that's the question he says everybody else wants to know. Further on down, about 6 lines or so, he says, if there was a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe. No more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or a staircase or a fireplace in that house. So he's saying this thing, this conscience, whatever it is, uh, you know, sort of gradually speaking, um, it cannot be known as a thing. So you can't look at a tree and say that must be this intelligence. You can't look at a stone or a mountain and say that must be this intelligence. It's not that. He's saying, you know, you can't know an architect any more if you understood what he designed. In other words, you could not know that architect. The architect is not the stairwell. The architect is not um, the family room. The architect isn't the how the hallway is designed. You can know something about the architect, but that's not who he is. So the world in which we live is not God Himself. It is a world. It is a physical world. But we can study this world in a way that whoever created it revealed some things about themselves. And so Lewis hints here what is called the teleological argument for the existence of God, the argument of design. So, if any of you are creative and you make things, we can study what you make and we can draw certain conclusions about the kind of person you are based on what you make, what your preferences are, what coloration you enjoy using, size, shape, function. All of those things point to some things about you. They aren't you, but they are evidence about the kind of thing, the kind of person that you are. So when you look at the created order, you can know certain things about God by looking at the created order. God must be orderly. Uh, God must be about law because the natural law is law. And if you violate that law, it can go very poorly for you. Um, God must be about beauty because when you look at the created order, it's beautiful, and so God must be a person who's beautiful and must love things that are beautiful as well. So Lewis is hinting here, I think, at the argument of design that we call the teleological argument that we may get into more later on, and certainly I'll get into in my sermon uh, series that I'm doing on apologetics. So he's saying that when you think about this, then why doesn't this arouse people's suspicions? Well, it does. It does arouse a lot of people's suspicions about, like, is this really all an accident? I mean, really, did this? I mean, what thing that has been created? In other words, is there anything that humanity has created that created? Is there anything that is there anything that we have created that somebody could come along and say, well, that thing started on its own? It the house that you built, you had nothing to do with that. It spontaneously constructed itself. There was no prime mover like you. It just happened. Um, so Lewis is saying, that should cause some suspicions, and not only that, but then, when we look at what has been created, like the house that we built or a craft that we make or whatever, it can tell us something about ourselves as well. And he's saying all of this should raise some suspicions. And so he goes on then to say that, and he uses this example, and so I'll begin 4 lines up from the bottom where he says, "Suppose someone asked me, when I see a man in a blue uniform going down the street, leaving little paper packets at each house, why I suppose that they contain letters. I should reply, because when he leaves a similar little packet for me, I find it does contain a letter. And if then he objected, but you've never seen all these letters which you think the other people are getting, I should say, of course not, and I shouldn't expect to, because they are not addressed to me. I am explaining the packets. I am not allowed to open the ones I'm allowed to open. It is the same about this question. The only packet I am allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open the particular man called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, and that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way." So, I think the point of this illustration is that uh, when we open up ourselves and look inside of ourselves, um, we see that there is something different about us, and that there seem to be some instructions given to us. And based on the instructions that have been given to us, it would be fair to surmise that those same kinds of instructions are for other people like us as well. And so he goes on to say at the last sentence there, "But I should expect to find that there was, so to speak, a sender of letters in both cases, a power behind the facts, a director, a guide." So we don't just receive letters arbitrarily. We receive letters because somebody sent them, and in those letters are instructions. In what no matter what the letter is, there's something about that letter that informs us about something. And so those things don't happen on their own. They happen because somebody is making them happen. So Lewis is saying that behind all of this moral law and this natural law, there is a mind, there is a conscience. And these things did not happen on their own, but they happened because that conscience and that mind made it happen. And so I think, and this is a shorter chapter, I think that's the essence of what Lewis is really getting at in this particular chapter. And if we were in a room together, then we would be able to ask some questions. But you can see that Lewis has advanced the discussion now to where there is this conscience, this mind behind all of this, and that he hints at not only the moral law early in earlier chapters, or what you would call the anthropological law, a law that everywhere throughout all of humanity, there's no tribe, there's no group of people who don't have a sense of oughtness, um, who do not have a sense of law, and from that a sense of rightness and wrongness. Those things are ubiquitous. They are true for all people in all places and at all times. He then advances the argument by saying, well, this must have come from somewhere. It didn't happen on its own. And so he hints towards a cosmological argument for the existence of God, where there's a prime mover, where somebody made these things happen. And then a teleological argument for the existence of God, he hints at by saying, look, these things are designed in such a way, it seems to point to, they are not this conscience, but they tell us something about the conscience or the mind that is behind all of this. Um, and so I think that that's uh, the basis of this particular chapter, and important to understand in terms of how he's advanced the conversation. And so, not next week, because we won't be doing next week because that's a holiday weekend. We will be in book 2 of this Mere Christianity, and the rival conceptions of God is what he will be addressing, which should be interesting, and I think you will find it to be fascinating. And so, hopefully, that will help too. As always, you are welcome to leave any questions you have in a chat thing, to text me, to call me, or whatever. If you see me out there, you're welcome to share this particular video, and let people know. So, thank you for joining us, and thanks for being a part of this book study. And I appreciate it very much. Take care, and God bless. Bye bye.